These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Maurice Jackson on Esther Cooper Jackson. Africa World Now Project is next. It is without hyperbole to suggest that Esther Cooper Jackson is one of the most important organizers, thinkers, writers in the history of the world broadly, the Africana world specifically, for over 8 decades. Her intellectual contributions, her insight and foresight, her writing, her ability to organize organizers, her kindness, her love for and hope in Black people, her modeling of radical care for intentionally extended community and her family, her vision to see beyond the parameters of now, the moment, are all foundational to what Robin DG Kelley calls freedom dreams, as well as the clearest articulation of what Amilcar Cabral called for all revolutionaries to commit, that is, class suicide. For Maurice Jackson, Esther Cooper Jackson was the soul of Black folks, the soul of humanity, the salt of the earth. From her days at Washington's historic Dunbar High School to Oberlin and to Fisk University, she fought for equality. From her co-founding of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, she is a warrior for justice. During the fascist-like McCarthy era, she stood as a woman of enormous courage, where she and Jack devoted themselves to each other, to their daughters, and to the great cause of their and our time, through thick and thin. Hers was a life supreme, where throughout her century plus 5 years, she emitted love supreme for humankind. Nothing could be finer. Frick Chapman, executive director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, who met Esther Jackson in 1963, just 2 years after he had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to life and 50 years in a Missouri state prison, told People's World, "What inspired me to write her was a fellow prisoner who gave me a copy of Freedom Ways." 3 years later, in the summer of 1966, Freedom Ways published an article Chapman had written titled Science in Africa. Chapman further reflects that Esther helped my case getting national attention. It was also the beginning of a relationship with Esther and Jim Jackson that stayed with me throughout the time I was in prison, 13 more years after 1963, and until now, almost 58 years later. For Chapman, Esther Jackson is a long-distance warrior for freedom. In this meeting, Esther Cooper Jackson, Robin DG Kelley reflected that when he visited her in her Brooklyn apartment, by this time he had already met with James Jackson and spent time in the South, he was prepared with poignant questions and detailed information. But for Kelley, what he remembered the most was that during this initial meeting, she began by interviewing him. She wanted to know who he was, who his people were, why on earth was he interested in communists. Reflecting further, Kelley recalls being particularly struck by the description of the cadre of young Black radical couples in Birmingham who worked consciously to eradicate sexism within their households. Esther talked about how she and her husband, Ed Strong and Augusta Strong, Lewis and Dorothy Burnham, attempted to share housework and share child-rearing activities, as well as public speaking and organizational leadership. Unlike so many other social justice organizations, the women were not chained to mimeograph machines. As Esther explained to Kelley, then the men actually thought that to be a good communist, you struggled on the women question. Esther Cooper Jackson completed her thesis in 1940, and it caught the attention of renowned sociologist Robert Park, who offered her a fellowship to work on her PhD under his direction at the University of Chicago. Cooper, however, turned it down and opted instead to work for the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Birmingham. She intended to complete her graduate studies one day, but she got, quote, busy organizing the South. Nevertheless, Cooper's thesis, titled The Negro Woman Domestic Worker, was a part of a larger discussion in politically progressive Black women's circles and in the African American community generally about the plight of female household workers. Black periodicals during these years were filled with probing articles on this subject. The chance to organize in the South and to materialize her commitment to racial justice and democracy was for Cooper just too good an opportunity to pass up. To be sure, Cooper never abandoned her interest in writing and intellectual analysis, as best displayed in co-founding and serving as editor of Freedom Ways magazine that creatively bridged politics, culture, and activism for a quarter century. In this light, her master's thesis stands as an important early development in the making of a Black radical activist intellectual who helped usher in the modern civil rights movement. Cooper's thesis, along with the writing and activism of Black women on the left, foreshadowed arguments made by Black communist leaders and theoreticians such as Claudia Jones, who argued that after World War II, Black laboring women constituted the most exploited segment in the African American community and in the U.S. working class. Therefore, Black women, not industrialized white workers, represented the vanguard of the working class. It is here orthodox Marxism and traditional approaches to labor organizing were turned on their heads, suggesting radically new ways in which to theorize race, gender, class, and politics while promoting social change. Ideas that were further developed after the late 1960s by the Third World Women's Alliance, Combahee River Collective, Angela Davis, and Bell Hooks, amongst others. Esther Cooper Jackson's range of thought reflects the depth of her understanding of the role of Black cultural production as an essential component of the Black freedom struggle as well. Jonetta Richards highlights this when she writes in Fundamentally Determined, James E. Jackson and Esther Cooper Jackson at the Southern Negro Youth Congress 1937 to 1946 that, as an organizational secretary for the SNYC, Esther Cooper spent a good deal of time managing the Association of Young Writers and Artists. The prospectus of this association stated its purpose as, "The long struggle for freedom and citizenship has been the central aspiration of poets, writers, artists, and in the day-to-day lives of millions in the cities and on the farms in the South. This story will be written and sung, painted and dramatized. It is a story that spans 300 years into the past and stretches into the future." Gerald Horne adds to our reflections on Esther Cooper Jackson, stating that she was part of an astonishingly excellent cohort of Black women of an earlier generation, including Claudia Jones, Shirley Graham, Louise Patterson, and Dorothy Burnham, who is still with us, fortunately, at the age of 108, who will serve as role models and inspirations for all of us, but especially Black girls for generations to come. Angela Davis, previously reflecting on the role of the concept of legacy in relation to James and Esther Cooper Jackson, suggests that we must take the time to ask, how might we define legacy? What is our relationship to the past? What are our negotiations through history? How do we manage different and sometimes conflicting temporalities? Legacy could be defined in two ways. One, a gift by law, especially of money or some personal property. Two, something transmitted by or received from an ancestor or predecessor or from the past. In both instances, there is an assumption that somehow the past is securely segregated from the present. Of course, in law, the originator of the legacy must first die in order for it to be transmitted. Professor Davis adds more sharp clarity to this frame, adding that the civil rights movement had to be declared dead in order for its legacies to be celebrated by the dominant culture. These legacies are also represented as individualized rather than collective. Individual figures transformed into icons become the signs of these struggles. Davis points to the fact that there has been no attempt to assimilate the legacies of the Southern Negro Youth Congress into a so-called triumphant narrative about American democracy. There's been no attempt to assimilate the legacies of the Communist Party, at least not explicitly, precisely because these legacies of people like James and Esther Cooper Jackson and those with whom they worked and struggled for so many decades point to unfinished agendas of freedom. The Jacksons and their comrades fought and continue to fight for freedom that could never be assimilated into a project of U.S. global domination through war and torture, through the wholesale denial of human rights. Davis, reflecting further on her relationship to the Jacksons, writes that it is not a scholarly relationship. My relationship to the Jacksons is personal and political. And in thinking about my connection with them over the years, I realized that I cannot undo the entanglement of the personal and the political. Elaborating on the realization of the connection between the personal and the political, Davis highlights an excerpt from a letter Esther quoted in her pamphlet, This Is My Husband, Fighter for His People, Political Refugee, written on the stationery of the Tobacco Stemmers and Laborers Industrial Union, which Jack had helped to organize at the export factory of the British American Tobacco Company in Richmond, Virginia, while Esther was still at Fisk. Jack writes, "Already I have missed the glorious Fisk hospitality, and most especially your contribution to the joyous stay I had there. Of all the happy memories of my trip, acquaintance with you will stand out in bold outline. A native unselfishness, a will to serve and to sacrifice, an ardent devotion to our cause symbolized in the youthful beauty of a charming lady. And that's Esther to me." Davis writes further, this passion, personal and political passion, so entirely intertwined with each other that it would have been impossible to separate the personal from the political. I think about the extent to which Esther and Jack and all of their friends and comrades, Dorothy Burnham, Lewis Burnham, the Strongs, my mother Sally Bell, who were involved in the organizing of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, were totally driven by this personal political passion. Those who have been fortunate to meet Esther Cooper Jackson, whether personally, politically, or indirectly through her legacy with Freedom Ways or related organizing work, must now, more than ever, intentionally ensure that generations to come meet her as well. We all must listen to Esther Cooper Jackson's instructions more closely now, developing an ear to hear deeply. Listen beyond the dominant narratives that distort the ability to develop a clear analysis of the relationship between the past and the present, with a clear vision of the future. Next, we present a recent conversation with Maurice Jackson where we reflected on the life of Esther Cooper Jackson, her thought and practice, as well as her impact on his personal and intellectual development and organizing activities. Maurice Jackson is an associate professor who teaches in the History and African American Studies Department and is an affiliate professor of music, focusing on jazz at Georgetown University. Before coming to academia, he worked as a longshoreman, shipyard rigger, construction worker, and community organizer. He is author of a range of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, as well as Let This Voice Be Heard, Anthony Benecet, Father of Atlantic Abolitionism, co-editor of African Americans in the Haitian Revolution, Selected Essays and Historical Documents, Quakers and Their Allies in the Abolitionist Cause, 1754-1808, and DC Jazz, Stories of Jazz Music in Washington, D.C. He has lectured in France, Turkey, Italy, Puerto Rico, Qatar, served on Georgetown University Slavery Working Group, and is a 2009 inductee into the Washington, D.C. Hall of Fame. He was appointed the inaugural chair of the D.C. Commission on African American Affairs, where he presented an analysis, African American Employment, Population, and Housing Trends in Washington, D.C. in 2017. He is currently completing work on Halfway to Freedom, The Struggles and Strivings of African Americans in Washington, D.C., to be published by Duke University Press. His next projects will be We Knew No Other Way, The Many-Sided Struggle for Freedom, and Black Radicalism, a very short introduction. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think deeply, act accordingly. Enjoy the program.
So I got a call in, email from Margaret Burnham. She was in Boston, Judge Margaret Burnham, who was Louis Burnham's daughter, and just telling me that we need to call Esther. So we called her from Qatar, and then we had been away, so we got back. And we decided, and then Lena had gone up to see her, so we decided we needed to go. Laura and I went up, and she didn't recognize Laura, but she recognized me, mainly because of the boys, and I spent so much time with her. And it's been a lovely hour or so with her. And that was 2 days before her birthday, and she died 2 days after her birthday. So we were just very happy that they've been many times if I've had friends, and I probably should have kept in closer touch with them, and I didn't, and then all of a sudden they're gone. It didn't happen much, because most of the time when my friends get older and stuff like that, I do keep in touch. But I'm so glad that we were able to spend that time with her. So
yeah. And just for, I guess to kind of, structure our conversation, for a more wider audience, talk a little bit about, Esther Cooper Jackson's background, like, you know, where she comes from. And
right.
because we really want to build a conversation around, you know, an intellectual history, but also how it was impacted folk around who were the people, the institutions, but also eventually we'll definitely kind of get to how she and her husband impacted you as well. But talk a little bit about, you know, who she was.
Well, let me first say how I got to meet Esther. I first got to meet her, it's the early 70s, I think it was around 74, and they were having a big anniversary of Jack's birthday. And of course, people like that, James Jackson, people like that, you know, the reputation had preceded them. So I was young. I had left Fisk. I had gone to Washington. I was seeking out the Communist Party, but you couldn't find it because everybody was underground, so to speak. Anyway, I went up there and I met them, and then we had the same last name, but not related. We both were from Virginia. And then next thing I know, whenever I was in New York, I was always staying with them and got to know Esther. And in a way, she became like a mother. And so I constantly, in staying with them, heard stories. And there were many stories about Esther, but the one that most impressed me, the one that I just stuck with me, was that in the years in Birmingham, she went down with the Southern Negro Youth Congress. She went down, Jack went down, Louis Burnham and his wife, and Ed Strom and his wife, and they all went down. And Esther would get up every morning at 4:30 or 5, and coming to her house would be Hosea Hudson, the great Hosea Hudson, the steel worker. And she basically taught him how to read and write by coming over. And they were extremely close. And here's this erudite woman from Virginia and this man who had gone through so much during that period. And then, of course, the Cold War came. And they all stayed in the house. And Coleman Young is there. And often I would say, sometimes I ran to Coleman Young, and he'd be in the presence of Esther and Jack. And, of course, they'd reminisce about those days. And Coleman Young had gone, you know, in a different direction. So Esther is first to me an educator. And, of course, she was from Arlington out here, but in those days, the schools weren't very good, so she came to Dunbar, which was the premier high school in America, bar none, black or white, public high school. And she came from Arlington, so she'd have to pay, and so she stayed with an aunt. And every Monday morning or Sunday night, her father would bring her in, her and her sister Paulina, and then on Friday nights, he'd come and pick them up and take them back out there. Her father was a military man, her mother, Esther Cooper, who had worked with many women here in Washington and had worked with Miss Burroughs and Nanny Helen Burroughs and others. That's what she had come for, working with the Training Institute. And so Esther had that background, then of course on to Oberlin, a school in the Underground Railroad. And then from Oberlin, got a fellowship to Fisk, and at Fisk, she was there working on her thesis that you've spoken about on a relationship of domestic workers. And was offered a fellowship to go and study at the University of Chicago. Had worked, with Charles Johnson and others, but decided that she had been smitten both with the movement and by a man named James Jackson. So they ended up both going to Birmingham. And then from that, she was always a great writer, but she found her calling to work in the mass production of ideas. And as you know, she became very active in a campaign to free Niecy Taylor, which is post-Scottsboro, and the rights of Black women workers. And when you talk to Esther, just the names that people come out, a conversation about Elizabeth Catlett, a conversation about Thelma Dale, a conversation about all the great leaders of Walter Washington, who was the mayor of Washington, of Coleman Young, and so many others. And then later on, of course, we get to that, she takes a role in the international arena. But like so many Black women at that period, when their husband goes to war and the children are born, they become primary, breadwinners. So one has to work. And she, worked in New York State, many things like that. But during that period when Jack was over in Burma. And you read the Sarah Risbeck's her great book on the life between these two people. And when I first joined the movement, it's very interesting because I had never, my mother and father separated when I was very young. Maybe a year old. I went and stayed with a foster parents for a couple of years. Wonderful people, very hardworking railroad people. But I had never and I was very young, and then I went to live with my grandmother down south for many years. But when I first started staying with Esther and Jack, it was really the first time I had seen a married couple, per se, worked together. And of course, their kids were grown by then. I was grown, early 20s. But it had such an effect on me just listening to them talk about child raising. When our kids were born, I took them I often said I had three models. Was Esther and Jack, who were much older, James and Miriam Early, who had older sons, and James Steele and Brenda Steele, all had three sons. And I became very close to all of them. Jim Steele became like an older brother to me. And I see him all the time. And they were very lucky. They were raised in households with fathers. And so was Jack. So I could hear these stories and that let me know the type of father that I would want to be. And Esther, of course, was so different from my mother. My mother was just a hardworking woman who just didn't get the opportunities. And my grandmother, certainly none. And so Esther was that. So Esther had this appreciation of domestic workers when she started writing about that. And I was raised by a grandmother who was not a domestic worker because she refused to go in white people's houses. So she was a washerwoman, just washing clothes outside. But it's very similar. She was very independent. She was her own boss. And that's mainly because she did not want to work in these white people's houses, but she washed their filthy laundry. So consequently, I don't know how to cook, because my grandmother didn't believe, she just wasn't a very good cook. But I could outwash and iron clothes anybody. I don't do it now, but I used to iron and starch all my shirts. So certain lessons you learn, and the appreciation of a different form of domestic work. And that's what Esther, put her life into. And then, of course, what separates, really puts her out there is when she writes this wonderful pamphlet, This Is My Husband. Jack had gone away, fought in Burma. They had been away from the family for years. She's raising the family. First, she's a mother. She's raising her daughters. And then Jack comes back from the war, and he and Esther finally back for a period. And the McCarthy period comes quickly. And Jack, because he's a leader of the party, has to go underground. And Esther's raising these kids while she's working. And it had a traumatic effect on her children because the FBI is following them everywhere. Following to school, trying to get them kicked out of school, going and gossiping. But, I was in the Communist Party for many years. And I remember when I left the Communist Party, you had two different trends. You had the FBI going out spreading lies to try to keep them getting work. And you had people within the communist movement, because you've left that spreading lies. And this is during a period when you had those two trends differently. People, the FBI, and then people who had been in the party, but who became, for better word, finks. They started turning on everyone. And a lot of people left the party out of principle, but some didn't. They left out of fear. And so, but they were all these different trends. Well, Esther wrote this magnificent pamphlet called This Is My Husband. And she talked about not just the question of husband, but on Black women. Now, at this time, Claudia Jones had written this phenomenal work on the role of African-American women. And Esther comes back and reedifies this with the role of African-American woman, not just as worker, but as worker, as mother, as intellectual, as thinker. And she had a great influence on people like that. And then, of course, in the process, she had known the great Du Bois. She had known Robeson. Behold the Land, this great conference that was held when Du Bois gives this a great speech held in Columbia, South Carolina. And with that lays to the formation of the ideas of the later basis, some years later, of Freedom Ways magazine. Now, this was not easy because Esther was still, Jack was the communist leader, Esther around, and the communists wanted her to make this their magazine. But Esther resisted that. This was a magazine of the people. And of course, having been in the party so long, it was a mixed bag. Some organizations, there was great flexibility, but even if you were in the party, they wanted to control how you work within that organization. Those are the principles that were established there. But they were to be more independent, more flexible, with that each person. But what Esther found was that some of these whites, including some with great bigotry, wanted to tell her how to run her magazine. So she quickly established that as an independent magazine. Even sometimes if Jack, her husband, may have disagreed with her in certain policies. And it was interesting because they always had principal discussions, never arguments. I remember once they differed because when Alice Walker's Color Purple came out, and Jack wrote a blistering attack, and it became, he probably shouldn't have written it the way some of the stuff was true, but it came across so blistering against Alice Walker that it created such a schism within the whole but Esther was able to handle it. Jack had made a mistake. Some of the things were correct, but he should have placed it quite differently. But in that sense, she was a great defender of the rights of women, and I think you saw the Boston Globe comments of Angela Davis. Angela Davis, of course, her mother Sally and her father Frank were very, very active in the South. In the South, if you lived in the South, you had to make a choice. One person had to make a living, one person could be the spokesperson. And so while Sally Davis was a school teacher, she was able to work. Her husband, Frank, is the one who had a gas station, independent of this. Rosa Parks had her husband, Raymond, who worked. And Rosa Parks was able to be a seamstress. And as you know, Angela, years later, when school is bombed, she goes off to Elizabeth Irving School in New York. At any rate, Esther plays this role of leading woman activist, leading Black woman activists, but she also is probably the greatest talent, scout. And in fact, while I never heard her say it, I imagined if Toni Morrison were today, she would have to say, living today, she'd have to say she saw how Esther discovered talent, because as you know, she was the first to publish the big books by Angela, and then Muhammad Ali's biography, and all these things became so great. But Esther, and when she found this magazine with the support of Du Bois and the support of Paul Robeson, and this is the period, of course, when Paul Robeson is being persecuted because of his ideas. When Du Bois, right before Du Bois gets his passport back, but they're taking this, they're persecuting all those. It's not an easy period. And of course, at the end of this, many of the communists are still in jail. Henry Winston is still in jail. Her husband is still underground. But they found this magazine as sort of a third way. And immediately, it has a big impact because it comes in the concurrence of two of the big events in modern history: the civil rights movement in America and the movement to decolonize, especially African colonies. And therefore, she becomes the first to publish Nkrumah. And Nkrumah, of course, had known her husband, Jack. He had known Langston Hughes and all those from his association with Lincoln University. And consequently, in concurrence with the founding of this, is Du Bois leaving America and going to Ghana. And then he dies, of course, on the eve of the March on Washington. But Esther is right in the midst of all this, publishing some of these first pieces.
No, it was interesting, and we'll pick back up. There's a famous picture of her and Jack sitting with Du Bois as he's preparing to go to Ghana at this particular time. And this is when, from what I understand, Du Bois is giving membership to the Communist Party.
Yeah, so what happens is that Jack actually goes with Du Bois to Ghana. And it's very interesting. There's a wonderful picture of Jack going with Du Bois to China to meet Mao Zedong. There's another interesting picture of Jack going to meet Ho Chi Minh. And, Jack was very light and mustache, so he could pass almost anything, and he goes there. Well, anyway, Du Bois gives Esther this letter. And this letter is his letter where he's going to join the Communist Party. And it tells her, hold it. He gives it to Jack, but Esther is the one who was the gatekeeper. Give it to Jack, it might get lost. And so he writes this letter to Gus Hall, the general secretary of the party, and he leaves it with them. And he goes to Ghana, and in Ghana, he decides he wants to let it released as he also renounces his citizenship. And I remember Esther and Jack saying, they said, Dr. Do you really want to release this letter? And he says, I said release the goddamn letter. And of course, they released it. And it's his last statement against U.S. imperialism, we should say. Whether he do that today or not, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But he goes there and they play this major role. And of course, Shirley Graham had written, I have the books up here, she had written and published in Freedom Ways before around the same time, because she has published children's books. I have a book up here, children's books on Booker T. Washington, others on Robeson. And so she became, and she had lived in Egypt for a while. So all this internationalism, it's another thing. Esther had traveled to the World Youth Congress or something for it, and she had been there, and she and Jack had both been to India, and they were so deeply affected by the independence movement in India. And there they got to meet people from all of these countries, from South Africa and others. So the world, in a way, became their oyster, and they became children. They were already children of Du Bois. And Jack had known Du Bois because whenever Du Bois went to a certain town, there were people he stayed with. There were no hotels to stay with. So he stayed with, the Jacksons. Esther got to know him a little bit later as she's working, and Du Bois moves to Brooklyn. And they, in fact, give Du Bois furniture from their house that is too big. Jack had furniture from his mother's house in Richmond, and Esther had some furniture, and Du Bois has moved in. So they tell a story about giving Du Bois this great big bed or something they had because it was too big. They lived in a 21 St. James. In fact, I remember this, the phone number is out of existence now, UL1718 UL73744. And just remember it because I called it so much, 21 St. James Place, apartment 15M, right across from Pratt Institute. So there was this great closeness with Du Bois. Then they would tell stories about Du Bois and Rose. And Du Bois usually go to his house. Du Bois is a man of great discipline. He smoked one cigarette for dinner, have one drink of cognac. If you're talking, he's going to bed at 10 o'clock. Now, you can keep talking if you want to, but he's going. Robeson come to your house, talking, maybe have a sip or two, and he go to sleep on the couch. But that's Robeson. You see, just the difference of people. I can imagine that I've thought about it. I could have, many conversations later at Robeson about anything, sports, music, culture. But Du Bois was a bit different, culture, high culture and things like that, but just different. And Esther was a cross between them both, highly intellectual in the sense, talking about many of the issues, but also in keeping grounded with the realities of, and she kept her husband grounded in a certain sense because Esther is on the ground. And then, of course, Esther sees, I think, before a lot of other people, especially a lot of radical, the importance of this Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And some of the communists were a little reticent because they were different. They didn't bow down to the past. They made mistakes. They make mistakes like the Black Lives Matter movement makes. They thought they were the only ones who had ever struggled before anyone else. But they learned to grow. And in fact, I've gotten some very nice correspondence from some SNCC members who knew how close I was to Esther. And they said, and one said almost, she served as a model for me. And I never thought I'd hear this, but she did because of this work, especially around editing and getting out the truth, because you have to put this stuff down. In many cases, even in the movement, it may have been whites who were writing, even in the party and other things. But here, Esther, the blacks would put these ideas down themselves. And they did not have to correspond with anybody existing in the ideology. They didn't have to correspond with the Marxist idea, but they had to be pro-independence. They had to be pro-black. And she, as you look at their tour board, she brought in different people, John B. Clark. But she had room for those different, because Clark publishes anything and he becomes very anti-communist, very anti-Marxist. But it's okay, because some of the things he's writing about, so she can bring together these currents in such a way that there's a model for the modern movement.
And it's very important because one of the things that you said, and we wanted to talk about this, funny, when you had a chance to talk to Esther, I did, you did the names and the relationships. One of the things that you get very, very clear, and you mentioned this in your thoughts about Harold Cruz. Harold Cruz is Harold Cruz. Yeah. And of course, which goes into my statement or my thought process specifically, is the fact that she was a true organizer, being able to move through these different variations, these conversations, these discourses with clarity and fluidity, but also is able to really see how these ideas are moving, in and out of each other, informing each other, pushing each other, those types of things. And, here I'm thinking about, the Pattersons, the Robesons, and also someone that you know very well, Jack Odell, who comes to, this, talk a little bit more about that. It's very interesting
with Jack Odell. So Esther was, of all things, organized. And so, they had this apartment, and I would often stay in Jack's study until it became too crowded. But Esther had her little office. She had an office, Freedom Rider's office, but she had an office in the bedroom, and just so neat and so much to everything and ideas. And I remember that even before I had met her, when I came to Washington, I dropped out of Fisk. I had gone to Antioch, and in Antioch, you had to have internships. So my internship was at SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And then I stayed on there to work. And working there was Dave Clark, who became the head of city council, Ann Holloway. Ann Holloway becomes Andy Young's person on African affairs, and she goes to the UN and works with Andy Young. And then she goes to Mali and becomes the ambassador. And she asked me to go along with her. Would I go? And of course, I said, and I doubt if I got security clearance, but I think I'd do better here. Well, I can remember sometimes the phone would ring, and I got to know her, and it would be Esther Jackson. And she's looking for Jack Odell. Well, Jack Odell out of Detroit and out of New Orleans, but Jack Odell had been a seafarer. So I called him Jumping Jack Flash, because Jack would move. He's always moving, ideas with notepads and brilliant. But he's not staying one place too long. He's moving. And it's hard to catch up with him, because Jack Odell had worked with Dr. King and, of course, Hoover, asked King to force out Odell and Stanley Levinson, which he does have to. But then again, Odell's ideas have so stuck with Du Bois that when he writes his speech, to the Freedom Ways Dinner in 1968, when he speaks about this, and he speaks about the role of Du Bois, but he goes back to Du Bois's Marxism. He shouldn't be criticized, all that. Well, Jack Odell is, of course, the one who's helping to construct those ideas, so to speak. And so Esther would often call looking for Jack, and then Jack would, because Jack has an article he had to read, he had something. Jack's expertise becomes expertise in international affairs. Educated man, but a lot self-educated, as a lot of sailors are. And at Antioch at the time, when I was there, Jack Odell was teaching there. Bob Rhodes, who became a supreme Marxist theoretician, Victor Perlow, James Jackson, and Jose Hudson. Well, Esther had taught Jose Hudson to read and write. So Jose, he could read and write, but he's not reading and writing at a college. So Jose would come there and give lectures, and I would write them out for them, or type out. My typing wasn't, but I could write them out. And then if he wants a book, he wants to find something, I'd go and find the materials on the book. And he was always so pleased. He said, "You have to show this to Esther," because Esther was, and I'll tell you a story about why I went to study 18th century instead of modern history. So Esther would look at this, and then when Jose would come to town, he'd go to Esther's and she'd have dinner for him. And Jose, of course, is so different than Esther and Jack. Jose is all working class. Oh, no, barbershop quartet, all that. But Jose, Jack and Esther weren't drinkers, but Jose liked his vodka. And at that time, Stolinskaya was just coming out. Nobody can buy it now because of the Russian invasion. But he wouldn't drink Stolinskaya. All he drank was Vladimir. It was the cheapest stuff. So he called me Jackie. He called me, "Jackie, I'm coming to town. You got to have my chicken and my Vladimir." So I would have, and we just talked the night. But when he get to New York, the first thing he wanted to do was see Esther, and they'd talk about ideas. She'd show him some of his lectures, which some of them I had written out for him. I wish I'd kept them. But I was her great student, this man who was older. And sometimes when they were all in Washington together, they would come and they would have dinner, at our house and things like that. So my wife and I, Laura, have great memories of seeing them together, and be very interesting. They'd be talking, and Esther and Jack would be talking, and Jose would say, "Shut up, young people, I'm talking." And he was older, but they were all older by then. And of course, in those days, if you're under 30, anybody over 50 is older. And I got to be over 50 now, I understand. You have to change your attitudes. But Esther was that to so many people, young and old. And that's why Angela's words were so important. And that's why generations of young women writers and editors owe her immensely, as she owed her mother, as she owed Nanny Helen Burroughs, as she owed Anna Julia Cooper, as she owed Mary Church Terrell. And she would always say, sometimes I slip and I say, "Terrell." She said, "No, it's Terrell." She always said that you have to make sure you pronounce it. And they both were products of Oberlin College.
And what is interesting, and let's just back up just a little bit to talk about, she was very interested in the 1960s SNCC, but, this is also coming out of a tradition, her and her comrades and collectives doing the Southern Negro Youth Congress, right? So talk a little bit about, that particular formation, her role in that, and also how that links specifically to her being very interested in, SNCC in 1960 as well.
Okay, well, the Southern Negro Youth Congress, of course, is founded in the tradition of the National Negro Congress and others. and they're founded with college people on college campuses, and Jack becomes a leader very quickly. Thelma Dale, who's out of Washington, D.C., and then Louis and Dorothy Burnham, and Ed and Louise. And these people, these couples become so close in the work, and they just work themselves. In fact, people generally say Louis Burnham probably worked himself. He died early of a heart attack, just like Charles Hamilton Houston did. They just work constantly for this, and work and worry. And they found this group mainly in the South, of people with different ideological views, and it takes such courage. You know, I often joke, Malcolm X talked about Martin Luther King and this and that, but I often joke, I said, Malcolm talked this stuff, but Malcolm didn't go south. So he stayed and he can talk about it as he's paraded by all these. So, and not that he wouldn't go south, I suppose, but he didn't. At least didn't go there. So it's a big difference. So you can talk about, but Kwame Ture and Cortland Cox and Marion Barrow, they went south. June Johnson, Dory Ladner, all those who I've gotten to know so dearly are here. So when they formed this organization, and it was during a tough time, just during a time of open lynchings against Blacks, about 80 a year. It's a time of open terror. And they had the courage there to go down in Birmingham, before it becomes Birmingham. It is still a very beautiful place. And they are there, and they go, and then Jack goes to Louisiana. They go in all these states. They're organizing workers. They're organizing textile workers. In South Carolina, they're organizing tobacco workers in Richmond. They're doing these things concurrently. Jim Jackson, Chris Austin, who later goes to Detroit. But of course, then the war comes, and the war, disperses people there. And then right after the war becomes the early Cold War period. But during this period, the Southern Negro Youth Congress becomes the premier. And these formations are forming all over, as you recall. In South Africa, it's a bit different because you form the ANC is formed, but it's formed differently because it's formed, but ANC forms on a model after the NAACP. And so you have anti-apartheid organizations that are modeling themselves after and coinciding with the SNCC. And then they become very active in the international movement, especially as the war trends are developing. And look at the people that develops out of it. Coleman Young, Chris Austin, Esther Jackson, Burnham, Thelma Dale, who leaves Washington, D.C. and goes to New York. Associated with them, Elizabeth Catlett, people like that, the artists. Associated with them are Charles White, artists, and people like this who go and make phenomenal contributions throughout the world.
And so she brings this, you talk about Elizabeth Catlett, you're talking about the cultural aspect, because a lot of what, the Southern Negro Youth Congress was doing was using culture as a political, educational foundation to really teach subversively in the context of just a very violent structure in the South, right? We're talking at the height. This is 1937, 1940s, early 1940s. This is a very important period where they are learning and on the ground how to educate or use political education as a real forceful tool. At the same time, she's bringing these skills to Freedom Ways, right? She's bringing these skills as a foundation.
She's bringing the Freedom Ways. Perhaps one of the first great articles I wrote, I read was about Max Roach writes, I think, something in Freedom Ways. He also writes in Black Scholar. Tom Porter wrote an article about freedom in jazz. And so a lot of people writing about that. So you're getting these jazz writers. Archie Shepp, writes a piece about the love of jazz and music and these. She's giving our artists exploring. But she also publishes others. She's publishing Neruda. She's publishing Nazim Hikmet, the Turkish. She's publishing Sean O'Casey. She's publishing all of their descendants. So all of these ideas, African poets and playwrights, Maya Angelou and many others are coming there. So to be able to read these. In fact, I had the Smithsonian did not have a full set. So luckily I had a full set of them and I donated my set to Smithsonian. They don't take a lot of, because to the African American Museum, but readers will be able to go there and just get every volume right there. And each volume was donated to a different, dedicated to a different thing. One on Africa, one on the Caribbean, one on the South. Jack O'Dell becomes one of the first Blacks that I know of who's writing about solidarity with the Palestinian people, long before it was popular. Understand that up until around the mid-40s and 50s, African Americans and the Jewish people are allies on many, many things. The NAACP, Spingarn and others go and join. The Rosenwald schools, where Samuel Rosenwald makes donations to found these schools. And there's a lot of agreement. But of course, some schisms comes with the establishment of Israel, not an establishment of Israel itself, which Ralph Bunche and others supported, but with the putting of the Palestinian peoples off of their land and a wanton treatment of it. And then, of course, the big other disagreements was the question of affirmative action. which many of our Jewish brothers and sisters believe was unfairly giving blacks an advantage. I've often joked, I've never seen a black person given an advantage towards anything, nothing that I know of. But it's also true, if you look at history, and as I tell my students, there's not one thing in American history that hasn't aided black people, that hasn't aided white people just as much. Reconstruction, public schools, public hospitals, affirmative action. I tell my students, they say, well, how does it help me? I say 3 words, ask your mama. And you see it right there, Title IX in education. Well, Freedom Ways brings up all these things. Freedom Ways has the first big discussion about the Bakke case in Illinois and the attacks against affirmative action and others. Freedom Ways has some of the first articles about, again, as I said, about decolonization, but from the people themselves. And great artists, an issue dedicated to the dramas, to the arts, issue dedicated to music, to theater, and so many published there. The development of Alice Walker and many others like that. Shonge, and then Brunswick becomes the cartoonists, and they have great cartoonists, Elton Fax, and so many others are drawing, and they're using art. And then one has the magazine. Like today, I have on my wall at work, Time magazine, some other magazines have Breonna Taylor, and they'll have Michael Brown and others like that. Well, Freedom Ways was the first to do that. And so people buy the magazine and even frame the magazine and put it up in the house. And so many other people are supporting it. Harry Belafonte becomes a massive supporter. As I said, Max Roach, Abby Lincoln, they're all these jazz figures are publishing, especially of Shep, Archie Shep, who's also writing poetry. And then to get many of the early writers, Godimer and others, Ruth First, people in South Africa, people who they've met overseas, who are brought to become the first to talk about. What people don't realize, sometimes it's distorted, that everybody became a friend of Mandela, but everybody was not a friend of Mandela's, even blacks. Many were caught between the PAC and the Mandela and the ANC. Many were caught between the fact that Mandela did not become anti-communist, that the ANC worked with colored people, the ANC worked with communists. You had all of this. Some did not accept that in Mandela at first. Later on, yes, because Mandela reached out. Mandela was very close to the South African Communist Party, Joe Slovo and many others. Many in our country, excluding some of the nationalist men, could not accept that. They had to learn to accept it. When Mozambique is fighting, many were saying, well, you don't choose MPLA, you have to give it, you need to just the same, but you need to, we find out with Hurley, Roberta and others were collaborating with the CIA. It's just simple fact. But some said you can't choose. It's a plague on both of our houses. And Freedom Ways never did that. Freedom Ways were able to take the right side. And looking at in the whole non-aligned movement, as you know, between the fight between Warsaw and NATO and the non-aligned movement there, Freedom Ways is the first to publish some of these independent voices. Of Castro and Cheddar Jagan and some who were openly leftist. So Freedom was able to see beyond the limited anti-communism that many black leaders had at the time and had to overcome. Mandela could overcome it, they could overcome, and they had to. But often people say they were right on these things, but it's just not true. It's almost like, I remember she was one of the first to publish some of the ideas of Ali. A lot of black folks weren't digging Ali. They can say they were, but they weren't. You go into a barbershop, you'd be fighting this strange religion, they would say, and they would be supporting, Frazier and others until Ali popped him, what's my name? Frazier didn't say it, but he wanted to say it. But the first to publish, Ali and defending Julian Bond, when a lot of people didn't defend Julian Bond. So Freedom Ways had those principles, and you just have to go back through the volumes and see. In hindsight, I often tell people, I said, you have to really look at the history as it is. If everybody who said they went to the March on Washington went, you'd have had 10 million people. But the fact is, they had about 250,000. Some people went, and some people just didn't have the courage to. The courage maybe is not the word, but maybe some were fearful, and but many were supportive of it, and saw the importance, of that, whatever movement. And that's the truth comes out. The truth also comes out about things like this, that all did not hold these notes. Vietnam, when she publishes, when they publish, Freedom Ways publishes King's Time to Break Silence. And of course, King is in a bind. because many black preachers don't want him to speak out about this when he goes to clergy and laity concern. Because if he speaks out about it, Johnson is threatening them. Look here, you come out against Vietnam, I'm cutting these economic programs. And King had to make a decision. And the black preachers are out of anger when he makes this, but he makes it in freedom where he has the courage to publish these ideas. King always, that's why on February 23rd, 1968, he was the one who gave the 100th anniversary speech. And he spoke about of Du Bois, and he spoke about the division of freedom ways in seeing all these international and the local being the national in all of this.
And, you mentioned courage and, that particular, and that's not just a judgment on people, but, as when you look at history, there is a reality. There is something that one can justifiably use as a frame of reference to assess behavior, because there is, there's a thought there. And so, there's also the fact that Esther Cooper Jackson understood personally the relationship between anti-communism and anti-Blackness, right? This idea. Could you talk a little bit more? You mentioned it briefly, because a lot of times we forget, or people miss the fact, or they will look at someone like Esther Cooper Jackson and look at these points, right? Look at Freedom Ways, look at SNCC, but she's working, organizing and doing work consistently, even in these particular years, basically like with the young folk, what we say is like holding it down, right? Holding it down, for a particular, because she sees something beyond the struggle. She sees something else. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that may have been a bit different than Esther and her husband. Her husband, Jim, is so ideologically motivated. He's I learned so much from him in the reading of the texts of Marx and Lenin and many others. Esther sort of loosened herself from those confines and we're looking at a broader way. And so in a way she saw in the youth something that maybe old others hadn't, and those more tied in. And of course, if you are a leader of a communist movement or something like that, as her husband was, you think everybody's supposed to follow you, but everybody's not going to follow. But that's what you think. And you think you're right. Well, Esther saw beyond that. And she saw the racism of the left more so than others. She saw the racism that existed within the Communist Party. She saw it when some who were ideological leaders wanted freedom ways to work under them. And she said, no, this is independent. And therefore, she had to go out and raise all the funds about that. But when she saw this talent, she saw these young people, they didn't necessarily agree with everything, just like we may not agree with everything at Black Lives Matters. And therefore, the Black Lives Matter movement really faltered itself. And I read a lot of this stuff when they haven't read the history of SNCC, or they haven't read the history of the student Southern youth. And people in SNCC, a lot of them did not look at the role of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Now, it's very interesting because if you recall, Stokely Carmichael's closest friend is Dennis, and Dennis is the one of his closest friends. Dennis is the son of Eugene Dennis, who was the leader of the Communist Party. So Stokely had grown up with all this. Stokely didn't necessarily have this anti-communism element. He had grown up in New York. He had grown up with communists. He'd gone to school with them. And even when he abandoned SNCC, or leaves SNCC, he calls himself a follower of what the Panthers say, Marxist Leninist Mao Zedong thought. And he developed this close relationship with Tico Ture. I mean, and of course some of the SNCC people go in a close aid with Nyeri. But Stokely, as I saw it, was not bound with some of these elements of anti-communism, as some were. And some of it was out of fear. Some of it was of anti-white sentiment. Some didn't believe that whites and blacks should unite together. And as often I tell students, you can say what you want, but there's not a movement in America of blacks that hadn't succeeded without some support of whites and vice versa. But it's done more. You just needed that because of civil rights, whatever it is. And I remember seeing some people were upset because the white women in Oregon who were fighting for, who carried Black Lives Matter posts, they got publicity. They were upset. Why are you upset? Don't be mad at them. Be mad at those who don't support it in that sense. But the importance of white supporters, and SNCC, our student NYC always saw it. And therefore, when they saw people like Viola Louisa and Goodman and Channing go down there and give their lives, this is in the tradition of white people that had come out of the tradition of Esther Jackson, of James Jackson, and many others. It's an American tradition of trying to unite the peoples of races and colors.
So this notion of the centrality of the working class is very, very important as well, because being able to see this broad spectrum also shaped. I remember having conversations with Esther Cooper Jackson about this notion of civil rights and human rights. So, and I remember saying, specifically, she was like, no, we always saw this as a human rights struggle as far back as, we're talking, her developing, and because this notion of a broad spectrum movement becomes, but the centrality of the working class, but also the centrality of Black folk in this particular struggle kind of leads or kind of colors or guides, a lot of her work that leads her obviously to develop a relationship, of course, with Paul and Islander Robeson, right? This notion. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Well, yeah. A lot of that comes from, her work was on the role of domestic workers there, and she saw that. She started studying the trade union movement, and she saw that some of it was fraught with racism. But what she also saw is what a lot of people in the South maybe see a little later. What I saw is that she also saw good white people. And if you grew up in the South, chances are you don't see that many. I remember growing up in the South, and I don't think I ever and I remember the first white person I ever had a conversation with. Now, this is in the 70s. You run Antioch College and people around the movements. Well, Esther, and working with the Southern Negro Youth, had worked with progressive whites. There have been many whites who joined with them. As she talks about them, the Doers and many other people like that. And then they had gone off and worked in Detroit. And Jack had worked there, but she'd also been working with workers there and worker education. So she saw the role of the white workers. And then they had lived in Richmond in the role of tobacco workers, most of them Black, but some white. And then they had seen the importance of the United Front in fascism, founded by Dimitrov and others, and the role of workers there, but workers with broader forces, with broader alliance, workers and artists and things like that. Then she saw the role of artists for labor, secretos, and all of these. And so she really early on saw that that not only could Blacks not win it alone, but if they were to win many of these struggles, they needed allies of the advanced class. And advanced class was the work class and the trade union movement. And of course, as we know, one could say with the one, if you look at the great battles in America, if you look at Lincoln's calling for 1941 boycott of in Washington, and then the March on Washington, the fact is that a lot of this was funded by two elements.
That was A. Philip Randolph.
A. Philip Randolph, 1941, when he wanted to call a demonstration because Roosevelt won't integrate war industries, and then of course Roosevelt makes some pleas along with Mrs. Roosevelt, and then 1961 they sort of 63 they re-up this. But who supports this? The biggest funds come from the labor unions, the buses, the churches, but really the labor unions are put out a lot of money. And Esther knew this, so she always got support of labor groups and many of the advanced labor groups there. But she saw the importance of working class and allies. Now a lot of this comes out of Marx, the role of the working class. Later on, it's adopted by many others, by Mao and others like that, Fidel and many others. But you see the centrality of working people who have nothing to lose but their chains, as Marx would say. And it so happened that most Blacks were workers. And it so happened that Blacks, when given the opportunity, joined trade unions in much larger numbers. But also we know how the ruling class tried to use Blacks in certain cases, tried to offer them jobs in scab labors, and how Blacks in many cases refused that. But it took me a long time to figure this out. Why in the world should a Black person not cross a picket line if white workers didn't accept them? And it's very complicated, and most Blacks didn't. But then I say, well, the unions, it's almost like, at the time of the American Revolution, some Blacks crossed over and fought with the British under Lord Dunsmore in the Ethiopian Regiment. And for years, I didn't quite get it. Then I realized that many went to Canada to get their freedom. The American revolutionaries wouldn't get their freedom, they had to get it any kind of way they wanted to. So Esther understood this. You don't support this. You don't support anybody scabbing. But that person's child was starving. So what are you going to do? You got to figure it out, and you got to offer support for that group. And Esther saw the beauty of trying to win over disparate force. And that's what Freedom Race could do it in a way that many other places, because it could reach out to all, and even giving people. Esther was not afraid of giving opposing voices a voice. Oh, it would not be a fascist voice. It would not be an anti-Semitic voice. It would not be an anti-Black voice, but did not necessarily have to agree with her. Had to follow the confines. Are you for freedom? Are you for liberty? And you make it disagree on certain ways. And that becomes, because the working class is very, very different, very divided. They have very, very much interest. It took a long time for white workers to realize their interest was to help organize Black workers. Some come to it, some don't. But now understand, she's working with steel workers, and they work with auto workers in Detroit. And then they get to New York, they work with hospital workers and public workers, which are generally much more progressive in that sense. And then, of course, many of them, especially in New York, are poor Jewish workers who have a sort of outlook which is not Zionist at all, but an outlook of wanting to bring people together of different movements and different causes, and just be supportive of those efforts.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the influences absolutely just should be glaring to folk who are actually engaging, this conversation. And so you mentioned Antioch College as basically a congregation of a lot of folk who knew James and Esther Cooper Jackson, of course, because James Jackson was teaching at Antioch College. Could you talk a little bit about, that particular institution itself, and we're talking Antioch in DC. We're talking about a particular center.
So Antioch in DC, it was an extension of Antioch, and they had a campus in Washington, one in New York. It's not in New York, in Baltimore. And so, and often there were old people like me who were dropped out of college. I dropped out of Fisk. I'd gone to work in the shipyard a couple of years, and I'd worked as a longshoreman for a while. And still pretty young. I mean, I'd done all that before I was 21. I just dropped out of it. I just couldn't cut it at Fisk. And I found Antioch just by a luck, and they were accepting older people. And older, I was 21. So I wasn't, a lot of people. And some people came down from Ohio, and they had such a strong, it had Jack O'Dell teaching U.S. history, and James Jackson, and Victor Perlow teaching economics, and Bob Rose teaching economics. And Tom Porter was running the graduate school, and Marvin Gentry was a sociologist, I think, and many different people. And they had a lot of dropouts like me, but people also who were working there with labor unions who could go, because the classes were at night. You could go to school and go at night. And it relied a lot on independent study. And so you could take independent and look at your own route, take any road you wanted. And you'd have your reading curriculums, and then Jose Hudson would come down, and he'd give a course on Black organizing in the South. And he just written this book, Black Workers in the Class Struggle. So we take that book and others. And he didn't use much, but his was stories, working class stories. Stories about being in the barbershop quartet, he'd tell. He'd tell a story about how, I didn't quite understand why he was telling, but he was telling a story about how one of his comrades in the barbershop quartet stole his wife. And in fact, he lost his wife at the same time he lost his job in the McCarthy period. And just because it happened, as those saying, no romance, no finance, so baby, get up off the go. And he didn't have either. So, but it happened to people. And you didn't realize that this McCarthyism has such an impact on family life and others and things like that. Well, so all of those people, all those lessons, and then they'd have international speakers. If the leaders of SWAPO or ANC or something came in town, they'd come to Antioch. Tony Montero, who was up in Philadelphia, was teaching then, and he was very active in Africa. They'd bring Africans, and so you meet a lot of the musicians who were coming. All these guys and ladies who are teaching Antioch are great lovers of jazz. So whenever the people and musicians are coming to town, they'd have concerts of Braxton and Amoye and all these people from the Art Ensemble of Chicago and many others, Shep and many others. They come to town, and Billy Brower was there. And Billy Brower was this great, he's a great impresario, so to speak, of Washington, a great jazz fan, and started booking all these arts. So you'd have this, just all going on. And it was Black and white, it was Latino, it was many others of many different backgrounds, and mainly older, a year older, not that much older, but who had dropped out, or some who just transferred from the Yellow Springs campus. So it was a great hub of political activity. Some people were conservative, and they were just different. Some were communists, some were as they would say, Trotskyists, some were Leninists, some were Maoists, all different kind, the disagreements that everybody would have. And I guess I was unlike most because I was an activist. Many were not activists. Many were just students. They were there. They were, just like, and that's probably where I separated from because I was still active. I had a job, but and maybe people didn't agree with my activism, but I was still very active in that sense at the time. Later on I became one of the top leaders on the political bureau of the Communist Party, but that was some years later. But because of the independence of thought that I developed there, especially working with Esther and Jack, when I decided to leave the party, I was on, solid ground. I knew I was doing the right thing, but never, like I never went out, and Jack never did, and Esther never did. We're not condemning anybody. We just moved on. Whereas it was the opposite. If you left, you were going to be condemned. But yeah, what can you do? But I'll tell you this story. So as I'm deciding I'm going to graduate school, my wife says to me, I'm glad that you, I worked full time for the movement, and I wasn't able to support the family much, and I was traveling all over the world. So my wife was glad. She says, only two conditions, really one condition: you got to be home for dinner every night. You study and you miss too many, so I'd go and study. And so she says, picking the field, and so I decided I wanted to study 18th century. And so she says to me, man, two things about you that are always consistent, right or wrong: you've never been boring, and you do everything the hard way. And by that, she meant, why in the world you want to go study 17th, 18th century when you lived a lot? Why don't you just do that? I said, well, one reason I don't want to do it, because Esther has sort of hinted she wanted me to write on SNCC, on Southern Negro Youth Congress. And I said, if I write that, Esther Jackson will be on me about every word, every concept. I can't take it. My heart can't take it. I can't take it. So I'm just going to write about something that I think. So I went back to, now I want to study 18th century anyway, because I went there to study with a guy named Marcus Rediker, who was an expert on piracy in the sea. And I was fascinated with that because I had worked it. But I often tell a joke, that's one reason why I didn't. Because Esther had asked me at one time when Freedom Works was closing, would I consider being an editor? And I said, Esther, I don't have it. I'm not versed enough to be editor of anything. I'd gotten a very poor Southern education, very poor in the South. And then I'd gone to Fisk. So I was still educating myself. And so going back to school, I had to learn to rewrite. I had to learn, in the movement, you learn to give speeches and you learn to, but as you know, going and your students, as you go, as you write, but you cannot write as you speak. And that's where African Americans, in many cases, it's from the African tradition. And you can't do that in academia. You have to learn to write in a different way. And Esther was versed in that. So she understood, and we laugh about it often, but it was just, for me, it worked out. Now, I'm going back writing about some of those periods. In fact, in preparing to talk to you, I had left something out that I had forgotten about it, is that in the 30s, when they're forming the SNYC, Esther's also working with the Fair Labor Practice Committee. And this is started by Charles Hamilton, Houston, and others. And she's meeting with people like Jewel Mazik and others in Washington, D.C. I had forgotten. So I have to go back in this manuscript I finished and I'm always taking notes and put it back in because I was trying to tie Esther to Washington. She had left Washington by then, Dunbar, but her mother was still here and she's very active in things like that. Her husband had been very active before they knew him at Howard, extremely active with, he's heading the Communist Club and Walter Washington became the mayor's heading the Liberal Club. But I was trying to find an Esther connection and I was able to find it in that. So I'll have to go back and add a few lines.
Well, you're welcome.
Thank you.
One of the things, and it's interesting because you're also talking about some geographical. So Esther is from Northern Virginia, Arlington area. James Jackson is from Richmond, Virginia. So this is a hotbed, specifically in the context of a lot of radical thought, a lot of activist movement, because they're part of a community. Right, they're part of folk who are moving in a particular tradition. We're going to come to a close, but one of the things I wanted to kind of put a pin in our conversation. I'd like to say, not necessarily end. One of the things I want to talk about is Esther Cooper Jackson and her husband James Jackson. Their love or their interaction with jazz, because you mentioned Max Roach, you mentioned Artie Shep. Talk a little bit about that influence, the influence of
Well,
the music?
Well, let me go back to one thing about Esther, and Jack. So you said Esther and Jack was from Richmond, Esther, and they're from solid middle class families. I was just the opposite. I had never been around that much middle class. I had known, but I never really. I had always been around working class people, even today. Even today, as I live in Washington, I live around a lot of up income people. But I have, my thing has always just been just the guy at the barbershop, and I go somewhere, somebody that's I'm doing all right for a poor cat. My wife would say, "You got to stop that." You're not. Well, I would always consider myself, there but for the grace of God go out. So Esther and Jack were from, you don't say a different class, but had a different upbringing with books and everything. I didn't never around music. They both were appreciative of music, but they were not connoisseurs of jazz per se. So they liked Max Roach and things they were doing, but I can't say they were great. What they were listeners of the music of their period, which would have been Count Basie, which would have been Ellington. Jack loved himself some Miss Lena Horne. He would say Miss Lena Horne. He loved himself some Lou Rawls, which was different because they wasn't of the period. But because he had popularized songs, and they loved the classical music, they loved the Germans, they loved Beethoven, All Men Are Brothers. That's the period they grew up on. They loved the music of Theodokis, who was the great Greek anti-fascist musicians. They loved Shostakovich, the Russian. So their music was of the period, and so the classical music they loved, like the Russian classicists and things like that. I don't think they'd have been hip without the chip. Except Archie, or my great man was Ornette Coleman. I loved everything. When I first heard Ornette Coleman, it was like the world opened up to me. And they probably would not have listened to Ornette. They probably would have listened to Abby Lincoln and some of her songs there. But they were steeped in tradition, of the 40s music, the music that you could dance to, the Ellingtons, the Fletcher Hendersons, the Louis Armstrongs. And when we listen to Armstrong, understand that most guys my age, they can lie to you, but we didn't have a great appreciation of Louis Armstrong. And one reason we didn't have it because he's clowning a lot. And then we read about it. But then I read something and it was by Dizzy Gillespie. And he says of Louis Armstrong, "Know you, know me." And Miles said, anybody wants to appreciate jazz, you got to start with Louis Armstrong. And those of us who were in the 60s and 70s, we digging Miles, we're digging Clifford Brown, but then we realized what Louis went through. And see, Jack and Esther knew this, what he went through in segregation, what he went through when he spoke up to Eisenhower, when Eisenhower wanted to send him to Russia to tell them that America was good in the midst of Sputnik, when he refused. And when Louis refused to go, he lost engagements, he lost business, like Robeson lost. And they had this great appreciation for Louis Armstrong that I did at the time. Then I read what Paul Robeson said. It said that Louis Armstrong had more courage in one pinky finger than I had in my whole essence. Well, of course, Robeson exaggerated, but that's Robeson, a man who gave praise to others. And then when I read what Bing Crosby said, he said, all American music begins and ends with Louis Armstrong. Bing Crosby, the great Bing Crosby, saying this. Bing Crosby, was so isolated from people. Once he made White Christmas, he never performed in front of another audience. And so Esther and Jack brought back to me that appreciation of people like Louis Armstrong, who expressed their music in different ways. And Pops now, that's my man. But I didn't always understand it. Like some people were slow to understand other forms of music. So that was their sense of jazz, very much the old school, the dance. But Jack also loved some Miss Peggy Lee. Now, who's Miss Peggy Lee? Miss Peggy Lee just white lady. Why? Because Peggy Lee is the one singing during wartime. And as he's in a bunker out in Burma, they're playing Miss Peggy Lee, you see. They're playing Miss Lena Horne, and they were always Miss. And so all that, and so that's what they're playing these songs to these guys who are missing their wives. And you talk about Jack and Esther, theirs was a love made in heaven. They just, it was just so interesting watching them, the way they looked out for each other, the respect. Jack felt he owed her because he'd just been away so long, first in Burma, and then the years underground and persecution Esther had to go through in raising children. So this a Black woman, but she did not, as many said, say I'm taking off just to raise my children, because she knew other mothers had raised their children and had to work too, and sacrifice for their daughters. And so they became sort of a model. They became like a power couple before power couples came to exist, who were completely supportive of each other, no jealousy in anything in this. And I can say, we'd get together and I would spend a lot of time with me. Jack and I would go into meetings, and that's making sure not just that Jack had his tie tied right, but me, that we looked right before you go out that door, and because you're representing, and then coming, and eat together with them. And they were eating healthy before people eating healthy. They weren't eating a lot of pork chops and stuff like that, but they were. And I can't say that I've ever, maybe they had wine in the house, but they weren't drinkers, anything like that. Maybe a little bit, but reading everything, every magazine, sharing ideas they had just read that day, sharing clippings and discussions. And the one weakness was Jack loved himself some ice cream. And so Esther would, whenever he would come down and stay with us, which was quite often because he was in Washington, D.C., and I had little kids, she called Maurice, is Jack getting some ice cream? And of course, I wasn't going to tell her he was, but Jack always had plenty of ice cream when he came in this house. So I just could never, and she knew it. I suspect she knew it because I had kids there, and they both became godparents to my kids. My daughter Lena was able to see Esther maybe a week or so. In fact, she saw a lot more than I did because I was teaching overseas in the Middle East. So just many stories and many remembrances.
Yeah, no,
but let me just say this one last thing. Please. When Trump was elected, Esther was so brokenhearted, and one reason was she said, when you get to be that age, she said, man, I saw something coming. Obama didn't fulfill all those dreams, of course he didn't, but she saw a black man president. She thought the nation was turning around. All these years fighting, maybe something would come of this, and then Trump was elected, and boy, did that break her heart. I think Esther. At that time, I think Esther was ready to meet her maker then. And then she lived long enough to see Biden, the election over. And it wasn't there was great faith in Biden, but it was a faith in maybe the country. And then to see the way his country is going now, to see the riders, to see she was living in Jamaica Plains, to see the way these bigots do with migrant laborers. And of course, Esther had come to fold, working about migrant laborers from the south to the north, and of undocumented, and of people who did not have freedom papers, so to speak. And this would have just broken her heart. So she sees this, but she had great pride when Mr. Obama took off. She knew some people who had come up in the movement whose children now are working. She didn't mention them, but she had, and she had great influence on a lot of intellectuals. Lanny Grenier, up at Harvard, many others like that, Margaret Burnham, who's up at Northeastern, Angela Davis. She maintained good contacts. Skip Gates, when she turned 100, he turned over his center for a big celebration for Esther. And so she had this broad range of people, and in her room, books were stacked up. Maurice, give me that book, show me that book, magazine articles. And I sent her things because she demanded that I would send her clippings of stuff that she may have missed, because she was still getting every day the New York Times and the Boston Globe. But of course, as a professor, I'm seeing other books. What new books? So I take it, but people always send her books. They get a new book. They want to know what Esther Jackson thinks. Up until the last day, she has that mind that's just continuing to grow as her body faded away.
That was very important to kind of again put a pin in the conversation, because there's a number of other things I would love to talk about. But again, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time. Of course, hopefully this is not the last time, but it's funny how you talk about Jack Odell, but you hard to catch too. So
man, Jack, we went to see Jack out in Vancouver. We just had the best time.
Yeah.
Just had the best time.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram @Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, Senior Research Content Contributor and Production Director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, Senior Research Content Contributor and Production Associate Dr. Josh Myers, Associate Producer and Content Contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, Content Contributor and Filmmaker Kurt Orderson, Technology Advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and Creative Directors, International Creative and Artist Designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.